Everyone knows about Cannae, or even the River Trebia. These iconic battles are etched into the story of Rome's rise. But the Battle of Ilipa, fought in 206 BC in the dusty valleys of southern Spain, is hardly ever mentioned. It often gets overshadowed. Yet, when you look closer, you'll realize it was a pivotal turning point that brought together some of the most intriguing personalities and armies of the war. The people who fought here weren't just faceless soldiers. They were political leaders, ambitious generals, tribal warriors, and young commanders striving to prove themselves. And yet, without the Battle of Ilipa, the Second Punic War might have dragged on for years, maybe even with Rome losing its foothold. This forgotten trap, set by Scipio Africanus, didn't just decide who controlled Spain, it cut the lifeline that kept Hannibal's campaign alive in Italy. Welcome to Heroic History, your daily history channel, where we share incredible stories of ancient warfare. If you're new here, subscribe so you don't miss more epic battles like this one. So let's take this apart, step by step. Why was Spain so important in the first place? Why did Rome even care about a land so far away from Italy? And how exactly did Scipio turn a single morning maneuver into a victory that flipped the war? To understand Illipa, you first need to picture Spain as Carthage's bank account and army factory. Before 206 BC, Carthage controlled a massive stretch of Iberia. They had held it since the Barcid family, led by Hamilcar Barca, moved in after the First Punic War. By around 218 BC, Carthage's Spanish Empire stretched along the eastern and southern coast. The rich silver mines at places like Carthago Nova, modern Cartagena, could, according to ancient sources, produce 25,000 pounds of silver every year. That silver meant wages for soldiers, bribes for allies, and a steady stream of resources that kept Hannibal's army supplied in Italy. And it wasn't just about money. Spain was also a manpower reservoir. Iberian tribes supplied tens of thousands of warriors, light infantry skilled with javelins, and fierce cavalry that could outmaneuver Rome's early horsemen. When Hannibal crossed the Alps in 218 BC, more than half of his initial army was Spanish. Without Spain, Hannibal would not have had the soldiers or the pay to keep fighting Rome on Italian soil for over a decade. That's why Rome could never rest easy while Carthage held Iberia. At the time of Illipa, Scipio wasn't yet the legendary Africanus who would later crush Hannibal at Zama. He was still a young man, just 20-something, trying to prove himself. To put it into perspective, in Roman politics, men usually didn't even reach the consulship until their 40s. Scipio was handed proconsular command of Spain in 210 BC when he was only about 25. That was unheard of. Why him? Rome was desperate. Both his father, also named Publius Scipio, and his uncle Gnaeus Scipio had been killed in Spain in 211 BC when their armies were destroyed by Carthaginian forces. Roman morale in Iberia was in the gutter. The Senate needed someone bold, someone who could take risks and inspire loyalty. Scipio had already stood out for his bravery at Cannae in 216 BC when he rallied survivors instead of giving in to panic. He had political popularity at home, and maybe most importantly, the name Scipio still carried weight in Spain thanks to his family's efforts. Scipio wasn't some inexperienced newcomer when he stepped onto the stage in Spain. He had already lived through Rome's darkest moments, and those scars shaped the way he thought about war. Take Cannae in 216 BC. Scipio was only a young military tribune then, standing in the middle of what became one of the worst disasters in Roman history. Hannibal pulled off his famous double envelopment, surrounding and crushing a Roman army that was nearly twice his size. Scipio barely made it out alive. But what he carried from that battlefield was more than fear. It was insight. He saw the danger of keeping troops locked in stiff, packed formations. He learned how speed, deception, and flexibility could turn the tide. And perhaps most important, he realized just how decisive cavalry could be when used at the right moment. Then came the campaigns in Spain between 211 and 208 BC. Scipio's father and uncle had both died there after splitting their armies, a fatal mistake that let Carthaginian commanders bring their forces together and crush them one by one. Watching his family fall taught Scipio a bitter but vital truth. Unity of command and perfect timing were non-negotiable. He put those lessons into practice at the Battle of Becula in 208 BC, where he faced Hasdrubal Barca, Hannibal's brother. Instead of meeting him head-on, Scipio used flanking attacks from higher ground, breaking Hasdrubal's position and forcing him to retreat. That victory wasn't just about clever maneuvers. It gave Scipio confidence in his own style of leadership. It also showed him the importance of working with local Iberian tribes whose support could tip the balance of a campaign. By the time 206 BC rolled around, Scipio wasn't just bold for his age. He was a commander forged by Rome's defeats, sharpened by experience, and ready to turn hard-won lessons into victory. On the other side of the battlefield stood two very different Carthaginian commanders. Hasdrubal Gisco wasn't a member of the famous Barca family. He didn't have the name recognition of Hannibal or his brothers, but he was still a heavyweight in Carthaginian politics and the military. What made him valuable was his ability to pull together big armies and build relationships with the local Iberian tribes. For him, the mission was simple but critical. Keep Spain under Carthaginian control and make sure the silver mines, the grain, and the steady flow of soldiers kept fueling the war effort. Mago Barca, on the other hand, carried the weight of his family name. He was Hannibal's younger brother, part of the dynasty that had carved out Carthage's empire in Spain after the First Punic War. First, their father Hamilcar, then Hasdrubal the Elder, then Hannibal himself had ruled in Iberia. To Mago, Spain wasn't just another campaign. It was the Barca family's legacy, the base of power that made Hannibal's invasion of Italy possible in the first place. Losing it would mean watching the foundation of his family's empire crumble. So despite their differences, Hasdrubal and Mago joined forces. They pulled their soldiers, their resources, and their reputations into one final effort to crush Scipio and keep Carthage alive in Spain. And to really see how serious this showdown was, you've got to look at the numbers. Ancient writers like Livy and Polybius don't match up on the figures. Some of what they report is clearly blown out of proportion. But when modern historians piece things together, a clearer and more believable picture comes through. The Carthaginian army was huge, something like 70,000 infantry, 4,000 cavalry, and 32 war elephants. That made it one of the largest forces Carthage ever put together in Spain. The foot soldiers were a mixed bag. You had the Carthaginian corps, some tough Libyan infantry trained in Punic style, and then the bulk of the army made up of Iberian and Celtiberian levies. The cavalry came mostly from Numidia and Libya, fast, skilled horsemen known for hit-and-run raids and skirmishing. And of course there were the elephants, African war beasts that looked terrifying on the battlefield, though in practice they were unpredictable and hard to control. For Carthage, the obvious advantage was size. Their army was almost twice as large as Scipio's, which gave them a sense of overwhelming strength. They also had the edge in cavalry, thanks to the Numidian horsemen, probably the best light cavalry in the ancient world. Their Iberian recruits added another benefit. They knew the terrain and could fight well as skirmishers and light infantry. And of course, Carthage had elephants. These animals weren't unbeatable, but they carried real psychological weight and could smash through enemy lines if handled right. But all of that came with trade-offs. Most of Carthage's Iberian troops were levies or mercenaries. They were fierce when charging, but they weren't great at holding formation in a long, grinding fight. Leadership was another issue. Hasdrubal Gisco and Mago Barca had to share command, and when two generals lead one army, decisions usually come slower. On top of that, Carthage's forces were a patchwork of different groups. That made the army look impressive on paper, but if one part started to crack, the whole thing could unravel quickly. Now compare that to what Scipio had when he arrived. He didn't walk into Spain with overwhelming strength. Ancient accounts suggest he only brought about 10,000 reinforcements with him, added to whatever was left of the battered Roman army still clinging on after years of defeats. Not exactly a great start, but Scipio's edge was never about outnumbering the enemy. It was about using what he had in smarter ways. By the time of Illipa, his Roman army stood at around 45,000 infantry and 3,000 to 4,000 cavalry. On paper, that's much smaller than the Carthaginian host, but the makeup of his force told a different story. At the core were the Roman legions, disciplined, heavily armed, and trained for tight, flexible maneuvers. Alongside them were Italian allies who fought in nearly the same style. Then, thanks to Scipio's diplomacy, after capturing Carthago Nova, he had brought a significant number of Iberian auxiliaries into the fold. These local troops gave him not just manpower, but also valuable knowledge of the land and a psychological edge against Carthage's own Iberian levies. So, if you break it down, Carthage had about a 25,000-man advantage in infantry. They had more cavalry and the added punch of elephants. Their greatest strength was discipline. The Roman legions were trained to hold together under pressure, to bend without breaking. Scipio also gave them tactical flexibility. He could switch up formations, blend legionaries with allies, and adjust on the fly. He held sole command, which meant faster, clearer decisions, and he had the loyalty of his officers. Through careful diplomacy, Scipio also won Iberian allies, who gave him both troops and valuable knowledge of the local land. Still, Rome had its own weaknesses. Their numbers were smaller, especially in cavalry, which was often the deciding factor in ancient battles. They also had no elephants to match Carthage's shock power, and while Scipio had Iberian allies, they weren't always as steady as the Roman core. If they wavered, the line could break. Everything came to a head at Illipa. This wasn't just a battle of headcounts, it was a showdown between a massive but shaky army and a smaller, tighter force led by a bold young commander. For Carthage, the stakes were life or death. Spain wasn't simply another outpost, it was the empire's lifeline. The silver mines alone poured out tens of thousands of pounds of silver every year, funding mercenaries and keeping Hannibal's campaign in Italy alive. And it wasn't just money. Iberia supplied tens of thousands of soldiers. When Hannibal crossed the Alps in 218 BC, nearly half his army was Spanish. As long as Carthage held Spain, it could keep fueling Hannibal's war and maybe even turn the tables on Rome. For Rome, the logic was straightforward. Cut off that lifeline, and you cut off Hannibal. Scipio understood this better than anyone. If he could drive Carthage out of Iberia, Hannibal would be stranded in Italy, bleeding men and money with no way to replace them. So at Illipa, the fight wasn't about a patch of Andalusian farmland. It was about the backbone of the entire war. So what really happened on the battlefield that day? Polybius tells us that on the morning of the decisive day, Scipio had his men eat breakfast early. Then he marched them out of camp before dawn. Imagine thousands of Roman soldiers already fed, shielded, and standing in line while it's still cool outside. At the same time, the Carthaginians were caught off guard. They had no time to cook or distribute food. Hasdrubal had to rush his men into formation without breakfast. That single detail meant the Roman soldiers began the day with energy, while the Carthaginians started it on an empty stomach. Now, picture the geography. Illipa sits in modern Andalusia near Seville. In late April and May, daily highs often climb into the mid-80s Fahrenheit, about 26 to 28 degrees C, sometimes hotter. The Romans had already eaten, but the Carthaginians were now standing in heavy armor in the rising Spanish sun, waiting and sweating. Frontinus, a Roman military writer, later summarized Scipio's trick in a single line: "Make sure your soldiers eat and rest, while the enemy waits under the sun, hungry and thirsty, with weapons in hand." That's exactly what happened here. For several days before the main battle, Scipio routinely deployed his troops in the same formation. Roman heavy infantry lined the center, flanked by allied Iberian troops with cavalry and light infantry positioned behind them. Scipio let the Carthaginian commanders Hasdrubal, Gisco, and Mago see his forces arrayed the same way, day after day. Polybius records that Scipio was in the habit of organizing his army consistently, and this repetition was no accident. Human beings form habits. Commanders under stress do the same by conditioning the enemy to expect a fixed pattern. Scipio weaponized their assumptions. Hasdrubal, watching these repeated setups, naturally assumed that the Roman deployment would not change on the day of the decisive engagement. On the big day, Scipio flipped the script. This was a critical move. The Roman legions, highly trained and experienced, were now on the flanks instead of the center. Meanwhile, the center, occupied by Iberian allies, appeared weaker than it actually was, luring the Carthaginians into committing their best forces there. Why? Because Hasdrubal had placed his most reliable Libyan and Carthaginian veterans in the middle, expecting them to face Roman legions head-on. Instead, they ended up facing Scipio's Iberian allies, who were under orders not to charge aggressively, just to hold ground. Meanwhile, the weaker Carthaginian Iberian troops on the flanks suddenly had to fight the elite Roman legions. It was a deliberate mismatch. At the same time, Scipio moved his troops out earlier than usual at dawn, before expected. Carthaginian troops, accustomed to a late morning deployment, were caught unprepared, still organizing, feeding, or marching into position. This early start forced them into a rushed, improvised response, making it far more difficult to adjust to the sudden Roman formation. There was the psychological effect. After days of seeing the same pattern, Hasdrubal assumed that the Romans would behave predictably. This fake stability meant he was less likely to prepare contingencies for an unexpected deployment. Modern historians call this tactic a refused center. You keep your middle passive, but hammer with the sides. It's the opposite of what Hannibal had done years earlier at Cannae. Scipio basically created a reverse Cannae, winning the wings and rolling inward. From the very start, Scipio opened with cavalry and light troops, elites armed with javelins, harassing the Carthaginian flanks. These weren't random skirmishes. They were designed to drag Hasdrubal's men out, keep them under the sun, and create fatigue before the heavy fighting even began. Then, when the Carthaginian Iberians were tired and sweating, Scipio sent in his legions. Heavy shields locked, Pila throwing spears flew, and the disciplined Roman infantry pressed forward. It was like sending in fresh boxers against opponents who had already been sparring for an hour without water. In the middle, Scipio's Spanish allies had a simpler job: just don't break. They didn't need to crush the Libyan veterans, they only had to delay them. Imagine a tug of war where the rope in the middle isn't moving much, while on the sides, the Romans are steadily gaining ground. Carthage's center, composed largely of Iberian levies, suddenly faced well-trained Roman legionaries instead of the allied troops they had been expecting. These tribal levies excelled at skirmishing and hit-and-run tactics, but were less capable of prolonged, disciplined melee against heavy infantry. Polybius and modern analyses emphasize how the center was engaged by Roman forces and held under pressure, unable to break through, which left the flanks vulnerable. The Carthaginian center, even though it was filled with elite troops, could not swing to help their collapsing wings. They were effectively pinned. Once the Roman legions had pushed back the flanks, Scipio unleashed his cavalry and reserves. Roman and Numidian horsemen rode around the sides, striking into the backs of the Carthaginian lines. Think of dominoes falling. Once the wings bent, the whole formation started to crumple. The maneuver produced what modern historians call a light double envelopment. As Carthage's center became engaged and focused on resisting the apparent center assault, the Roman legions on the wings advanced inward, pinching the Carthaginian wings from both sides. The Carthaginian cavalry and elephants, which had hoped to dominate the flanks, were suddenly exposed to concentrated Roman attacks. The overall effect resembled a pincer rolling up the enemy forces, though it was not the textbook Cannae double envelopment. The geometry of the battlefield and the resulting collapse were similar. The enemy was squeezed, unable to support vulnerable points, and cohesion broke rapidly. Ancient sources say the Carthaginians tried to retreat to their camp, but the Roman cavalry was everywhere. Polybius describes the move as decisive, the moment when Hasdrubal's army lost all cohesion. With wings shattered and cavalry slashing at their rear, the Carthaginians couldn't reorganize. Those numbers may be exaggerated, but the pattern is clear. Carthage lost the ability to fight in Spain. Only a fraction of Hasdrubal's army managed to escape toward Gades, modern Cadiz. Rome, on the other hand, had secured Iberia for good. The result of these key moves was a perfectly set trap. Timing and readiness were critical in making this trap work. By moving at dawn, Scipio exploited the habitual delays of the Carthaginian commanders. Troops that are rushed into position, half-fed, or still arranging their formations are far more likely to crack under sustained pressure. Imagine fighting 8 hours of intense combat with no food in your stomach. You'd start to feel weak, your energy would drop and your morale would plummet. Now that's what the Carthaginians faced. They had to march out early, hungry, without having eaten. Meanwhile, the Romans, having eaten and already digested their meals, were ready to fight. The Carthaginians, on the other hand, were distracted by hunger and thirst. Their bodies were begging for nourishment, and that made it harder to focus on the fight. The Romans marched out in the cool morning air well before the sun reached its peak. The Carthaginians, however, were forced to fight under the blazing midday sun. We know from modern data that Andalusian spring days can feel just like an American summer day in Texas. Hot, dry, and punishing if you're standing in the open with heavy armor. Multiply that by tens of thousands of soldiers, and you can literally picture the exhaustion creeping in with each passing minute. The heat was relentless, and it drained their strength hour by hour. Just imagine how exhausting that must have been. It's like trying to play a sport under the heat of noon instead of the cool of early morning. It's not just uncomfortable, it saps your strength when you need it most. Even with advantages like numbers, cavalry, and war elephants, Carthage couldn't simply adapt. Command friction played a role. Hasdrubal and Mago had to coordinate between separate forces, and joint command slowed decision-making. The sudden inversion of the Roman deployment disrupted staff work and communication. Additionally, many of the Carthaginian troops were Iberian levies and mercenaries, effective in skirmishes but less reliable in close-order combat. Facing disciplined Roman legionaries in a frontal melee, combined with a rapid attack on the flanks, increased the likelihood of collapse. Operational surprise compounded this. Reversing both disposition and timing compressed Carthage's reaction window, leaving them exposed to the mismatches Scipio had calculated. The outcomes prove the effectiveness of the trap. Carthaginian cohesion disintegrated, tens of thousands were killed or captured, and Rome gained unchallenged dominance over Iberia. Estimates suggest that Carthaginian losses exceeded 50,000 troops, whereas Roman casualties were relatively minimal. The strategic impact was enormous. Carthage was expelled from Spain, cutting off Hannibal's potential reinforcements and opening the peninsula to Roman control. Polybius's detailed narrative, corroborated by modern sources like Britannica and specialized tactical reconstructions, confirms the significance of the maneuvers at Illipa. Importantly, this wasn't just a simple reshuffling of troops. Scipio's strategy was psychological as much as tactical. He used the repetition of formations to establish expectations, then deliberately violated them to induce confusion and slow reaction. Polybius notes that he employed two different strategies, visible rehearsals followed by a sudden reversal. This makes Illipa an early, clear example of strategic deception in Roman command. The lesson is profound. Mastery of battlefield psychology, timing and expectation can be as decisive as raw numbers or individual bravery. In sum, the Battle of Ilipa showcases Scipio Africanus at his strategic peak. By understanding human psychology, exploiting habitual expectations, and coordinating perfectly timed tactical maneuvers, he engineered a victory that reshaped the balance of power in the Second Punic War. The trap worked because it combined deception, disciplined execution, and precise timing, overwhelming Carthage's forces and leaving a lasting mark on military history. This battle remains a classic study in leadership, strategy, and the subtle use of expectations to manipulate and defeat an opponent. Illipa wasn't just a battle. It was the moment that shifted the entire war. With this victory, Carthage lost all control over Spain, a devastating blow that crippled their ability to sustain Hannibal's war efforts. This also marked a huge turning point for Scipio, whose reputation skyrocketed, making him the clear leader for future campaigns. Illipa laid the groundwork for what would eventually lead to Zama in 202 BC. It may not have had the bloodshed of Cannae or the iconic showdown of Zama, but in terms of strategy, it was a quiet yet pivotal moment. It was at Illipa that Scipio stopped being merely a student of Hannibal and began to craft his own military genius. What can we learn from Scipio's trap at Illipa? The key lesson is that victory isn't about numbers alone, but about understanding your enemy's psychology and habits. Scipio's victory wasn't just due to better troops. It was his preparation and the timing of small yet decisive changes. It's proof that Rome wasn't just rigid, it was creative in the face of adversity. What do you think was the most important lesson from Illipa? Strategy, psychology, or strategic vision? Drop a comment, share, like, and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you tomorrow for more discussions.